Hey y'all. So I wanted to do a tutorial on React, and I'm going to show you the end product here. It'll just be a fairly simple clock that updates every second and uses Bootstrap to just show you kind of the progress as it tracks along. So I wanted to cover two different ways to attack this problem, one using ES6 classes and the other using a more functional approach and taking advantage of React hooks. Um, so yeah, same functionality, same progress bar, but just two different approaches to create the same output. All right, so I will start off by creating a new code pen. I'm going to bring this down here. And I have a template which basically has all of the base React code attached inside of settings. You can see in here I've added the React library along with React DOM. And then I also have just added Bootstrap. And then I selected Babel as the preprocessor. So let's start off doing the ES6 class approach. And right now I just have some boilerplate code. I'll share this link for the template in the description, so y'all can have it there, but we will start manipulating things here to create the ES6 class version. So first you'll just create a clock class, and that'll extend the React.component. I'm going to replace the component hello with the clock component. And then in here, what we'll want to do is create a render function and then return the specific JSX that we want to show. So let's just create something called clock as an H1. All right, so we have it rendering out the JSX. I'm just going to create this as a variable called heading and then render that out here instead of clicking in all of that. And I'll just wrap that all in a div. And I'll take advantage of Bootstrap and just create a container so it'll give it some padding. All right, so with every class in React, you need to create a constructor. You'll pass the props in, and then you'll call this super and pass those props in as well. So the way you create state in the class-based components is you'll create a state object and set that equal to whatever data you want to pass through. So here as the clock, we're going to be storing a date, and I'm going to be setting that equal to just a new date right off the bat. So what we'll want to do here is create a function that essentially runs as the ticking clock. So we'll call that tick. And all this is going to do is update the state and set the date to the new date. And we'll run that every second. So inside of that, we'll do this dot set state. Pass the object, doing pretty much the exact same thing. You'll never want to set state directly like you are in the constructor as you're updating things. That's just to kind of set it off from the beginning. Anytime you want to update state going forward, you'll use the set state method. So then we are going to need to take advantage of some lifecycle hooks in order to set the timer using set interval, and then we'll also need to clear that interval. So up front, we'll do component did mount, and we will create a variable called timer ID to basically grab the ID returned from set interval so we can use that later on to clear the interval when that is not going to be rendered. All right. So we will need to verify that the output of the date is going to show, just to make sure we can see everything. So I'll create another variable called time heading, and we'll make that an h2, and then we'll want to tap into the date and then output that to just the time. And under here, I'll create the time heading. Cool. So it looks like that's updating, and we can check just to see that these set intervals actually working. Once you take that away, it sits at the static date since we have no interval running. And then the last thing we'll want to do is when the component unmounts, you want to clear the interval and pass the timer ID that got returned from the creation of set interval. Cool. So the last piece is to create a progress bar. So let's search for Bootstrap and just grab the base code for a progress bar. So we'll need to create a variable to hold the progress. And what we'll want to do is get the date, and we'll get the seconds, and we'll just divide that by 60 to get that as a portion of 60 seconds. And then we will want to multiply that out by 100, and then we'll round that number up so it's not in its decimal form. So we can check what the output of that would be by just checking the progress in the console. So as each second is progressing, we're getting the proportion out of 60 seconds. So we can show that as a progress. So I kind of like using these variables to render out some of the HTML so things are a little bit cleaner. So I'll create something called progress bar, and we'll set that equal to the HTML or the JSX that we can then render in the return. So here we already have the progress shown here, so we just want to, the progress is showing in the console, so we'll want to output that in the style. So when you're doing it, rendering the styles out, you want to use double curly braces, and then I'll add the progress, and then we need to add it as a percentage. And then here we will add the volume now as well, and that doesn't need to show as a percentage. And then we will just output the progress bar. Cool. So that is how you create a class based component using ES6 classes in React. Now let's move over to creating the more functional approach to this clock. So again, I'll come from my template with the React base code, and that just is going to be a simple hello. So let's change this to clock, and we'll just output this and change the name here. Double check that it's rendering out, and it is. So we're going to be taking advantage of React hooks, and React hooks are a newer way of developing in React using just kind of a different formatting, and you can tap into pre-existing hooks that exist inside of React. Use state is a pretty common hook, and you want to call that inside of a function component to add state to it. So instead of doing this.state equals whatever data you want to pass in as state, you're going to do something like this. We'll create a date destructured object, and then the method that we want to call to update that state, and we'll set that to react.useState, and then we'll pass the new date in. So the difference here is using hooks. This is how you set your state variable. So date will be holding the new date that I pass into useState. And then whenever I want to update that date variable, I use the method setState or setDate. So just a little bit different in how you approach it than the ES6 methodology. So we can double check that this is working. I'll create a variable called heading again. We'll set that to clock. And then I'll create another one called time heading. We'll make that an H2. And since you're not doing the class approach, you don't have to mess around with calling this. You just call date directly. And then we'll get that as a time string. And then I'm going to wrap everything in a div again. We'll use some of the bootstrap functionality to wrap that in the container. And under the heading. And then we'll do the time heading. Okay. So you can see that it did set the date state to a new date when I use that React hook. And I am rendering that out as a time heading. So next, what we'll want to do is we'll create the tick function, and we'll be using setDate instead of using the class-based setState. And instead of passing it the new object with the specific key, all we have to do is pass new date because it knows that it's referencing this specific variable. So now that we have that done, we need to write some code to change the clock every second. So there's another built-in hook called useEffect. And what this is doing is replacing some of the lifecycle hooks like component did mount and component will unmount. It's a little bit of an easier, cleaner way to take advantage of some of these lifecycle hooks, so you don't have to duplicate a bunch of code across different hooks. So in here, I'm going to create the same timer ID and pass it an anonymous function, which I want to call tick every second. And then as a function of clearing the interval, we'll pass the timer ID there. And then essentially there's some funkiness around the way that set interval works in useEffect. So what you need to do is essentially tell it that when date gets updated, that it needs to run set interval again as it's going through here. So you can see now that every second it's updating the clock using the tick function. And next, we'll just want to add the bootstrap progress bar. So I'll come in here and do a similar variable. We'll need to create the progress. And we'll do date dot get seconds. We'll divide that by 60 to get the current seconds as a portion of 1 minute. And then we will multiply that out by 100 to get that as a non-decimal number. And again, if you want to just see what the output is, you can see what's going on there. So we're 86%, 88%. And then we'll round that number up to the nearest whole number. So we can pass that in to our progress bar. So then we'll create another variable called progress bar and set it equal to the JSX here. And then remember, we have to use the double curly braces. And then we'll pass the progress along with the concatenated percent. And we will want to set this equal to progress. I'll get rid of the console log. And then down here, we will render out the progress bar. Cool. So now we have our clock component using React hooks, taking advantage of useState and useEffect, along with set interval inside of useEffect. And you can see the contrast between the two pieces of code here. Where setting state and the way you update state is different using React hooks than it is using the ES6 classes. So this is the hooks clock. We'll call that the functional hooks clock. And then you can see here that you have to use a bunch of places in here where you're referencing this, and the way you set state is just a bit different in the class component based way. But yeah, I thought this would be a good introduction to React, a little bit of the differences between the way you build out your components, either using hooks in more of a functional way or using ES6 classes. It creates these neat little clocks that you can kind of just render out a ton of, which is fun to watch. So if I come in here and let's say we want to create 3 different clock components. We'll just render those out. And that is creating clocks using either a functional React hook way or ES6 classes. Thanks for watching my channel here. Please give me a like and subscribe. I'm new to some of this, but I really enjoy creating these tutorials, and every like, every subscribe helps. So thanks for watching.